Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 20th installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO and Managing Partner at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Kristi Bartlett from ZIBRIO and Abbas Dhilawala from Galen Data for a discussion on connected health challenges and how to solve them. But first, a few housekeeping items and some information on Galen Data. Galen Data is the cloud for medical device makers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards, built on 40+ years of collective experience developing compliance systems in the medical device industry. The goal of Galen is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. I'd like to introduce our guests today, Kristi Bartlett and Abbas Dhilawala. So Kristi is the Director of Product Development at ZIBRIO, the balance company, where she leads the design and development of products for fall prevention in aging. Kristi holds a Master of Science degree in Industrial Design and is currently pursuing a PhD in technology at Purdue University. Abbas co-founded Galen Data and serves as CTO, bringing to the company over 15 years of experience developing enterprise-grade software for the medical device industry. Prior to Galen Data, Abbas worked as a software architect at, I am most certainly going to butcher this, Titronics Software. Hopefully that's close enough. Where he led technical teams in creating medical device software that was successfully cleared for FDA Class 1, 2, and 3 products and CE marking. So with that being said, I'm not sure who's starting. I think Abbas, you are, so I'll flip it over to you.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thank you for joining this webinar. While we talk about challenges in connected health or challenges in digital health in general, I wanted to start with laying out some of the opportunities that come with connected medical devices. So connected medical devices, as you may expect, will play a significant role in healthcare in coming years. The US market opportunity alone is roughly 70 billion, or was 70 billion in 2020, and it's going to predict it to go to 190 billion by 2025. So huge growth, almost 2x to 2.5x in roughly 5 years. So there's a lot of opportunities in connected health and in the digital health segment of the medical devices industry. According to Anthem, which is they did a survey of, and 86% of doctors say that they get better patient engagement when they use connected devices. And connected devices are predicted to decrease hospital costs by over 16% over the next 5 years. So looking at those things, and as doctors success rate that, and then just the fact that hospitals are looking to cut costs or decrease cost wherever they can, 16% is a big enough chunk. So they will be looking, or they're already looking for connected devices as a solution there. So a huge opportunity there as well. And with 5G connectivity becoming more and more available, just more use cases are becoming possible. Use cases that were limited by bandwidth or amount of data that needs to shuffle through, those are kind of becoming now something that to look for. So the path to cloud connectivity. So, well, let's say you agree on the opportunity, you want to go down that path. What do you do? So today, that's what we're going to talk about, the different aspects you need to think about for cloud connectivity. And there's no real order, but you have to start with defining the need of what you want from connectivity. You have to consider kind of the hardware aspects of connectivity, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about that. Software consideration around connectivity, and I'm talking about just connectivity, hardware and software, not necessarily a device, general hardware and software. Obviously, the connectivity, hardware and software will play with, if you have a physical device, will play along with that device, hardware and software considerations as well. Then regulatory, very important aspect of it. When you add connectivity, what does it do from a regulatory standpoint? Does it add more risk? Does it take away risk? And there's a balance there. And then, as you would expect, when you connect things, you have to consider security. And when you collect data, you have to consider privacy of that data. And we'll talk a bit more detail about that. And then ultimately, the question about do you build or do you buy? And we'll talk some pros and cons around that. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of defining the need. So first thing, medical device lifecycle, building from ideation to commercialization can be a long journey, and depending on your classification, depending on kind of the complexity of the device, it could be anywhere from a few years to a few decades. So you have to kind of figure out where the connectivity will fall, but it's more important to understand kind of the use case. What will you do with connectivity? What exactly does connectivity offer you in terms of value to either you or the patient or the clinician? Hopefully all of them. Or what does it solve a need? Does it create additional value? Does it add? Does it take away some of their workflow, or does it add to their workflow? Does it complement the workflow? So those kind of things you have to understand, and that's very important. You have to also, it's not just the use case of, hey, I get my data and I'm going to do all this stuff with the data, which is great because that's a major use case. But then also, one thing we see more often is that the patients and the clinician are an afterthought in that thought process. And that's when digital health initiatives fail because their adoption level is low. So you have to think, how does a patient benefit from connectivity? How does a clinician benefit from connectivity? So ultimately, they'll be your users of your device. So when you're defining your use cases, make sure you have a patient advocate, make sure you have a clinician advocate in your team to take account for those kind of things. Also, maybe a secondary consideration, but consider things such as payers, your compliance teams, maybe your engineering teams. What data do they need? What is their use case for connectivity? Can your engineering team service your equipment remotely if you do connectivity? Can your compliance team get information about any complaints or any edge cases or any adverse events directly without having to do a lot of hassle to kind of get that data? Will the payers pay more because they can see effectivity of your device? Things like that. So those are kind of important use cases as well. Another use case to think about, does connectivity open up a new business model, right? So normal business, normal medical devices are sold as a commodity, right? You sell one and then you go away, you may service them, you sell another one. But we see more and more devices as a service kind of model where it's a use-based model, right? So you get paid as much time as they use it. Helps with budgeting, but also helps you keep a long-term revenue cycle. So think about that as well. And then the next thing, once you kind of figure out the use cases, the next thing is to define kind of what data will you need to either collect or generate to satisfy those use cases, and then who is going to provide that data. Again, you have to think about, is the data coming from a patient, and then if so, how are they providing the data? Is it automatic? Is it from the device? Is it something the patient has to input? If so, then what is kind of the interactivity aspect of it? Same with clinicians, or do you need to integrate with other systems like EHR or similar systems where the data is already there? Things like that. So define your data, understand where the data is coming from, what are you going to do with the data, and then we'll talk later, how to protect and kind of understand what, more data you collect, the more kind of surface area you open up for attacks. So things like that we will define. But what I want to do now is to kind of hand over to Kristi to kind of see how did they go through this process of defining the need, and how did they come up with the ZIBRIO stability scale? Kristi?
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about our product to kind of illustrate some of the things that Abbas just shared. So one thing that's important to know, and I definitely didn't know this before I started working at ZIBRIO, is that falling is the #1 reason for trauma death and trauma injury at any age, actually more than car crashes. But one problem is that current clinical practices fail to identify 69 to 85% of the at-risk patients. So current clinical practices are not doing an adequate job of identifying who is at risk for falling. And right now, the best predictor of who is going to fall is asking people if they've fallen before. And obviously, if you've fallen before, it's too late to really anticipate that you're going to fall. So that is kind of the impetus behind why we created the ZIBRIO stability scale. So how the scale works is the user stands still on the scale for 60 seconds. And if you try this, even right now, you could stand up and try to stand still for 60 seconds. You'll notice that your body makes small movements. And what we're doing is we're analyzing the patterns in those movements using a machine learning algorithm that's inside the scale, embedded in the scale. And that algorithm gives a balanced score. the score indicates somebody's risk for falling. So we have high risk scores at 1, 2, and 3, and the scores go all the way up to 10. 7 through 10 are low risk of falling. So our scale is able to identify 2 to 4 times more truly at-risk patients than the current clinical practices. You can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to talk about the benefits of connectivity. I explained how the scale works, but what's the point of connecting it if it already, predicts who's at risk of falling? So we have 2 versions of our product, actually. We have one that's for home users that they can use the scale at home, or we have a clinical version of the scale that's used in doctor's offices or physical therapy clinics. So home users really want to understand the reasons for their score. A lot of times people score maybe lower than they thought they would, and they want to understand, why did I score a 3? Why am I at risk of falling? So our app enables people to understand more about kind of the different health or lifestyle factors that contribute to their balance being worse or better on a given day, because balance can actually change over time. We also have the opportunity for people to track balance, because again, your balance may change from when you first wake up to later in the day when your body's been moving and you're kind of more warmed up. So our scale connects to the app via Bluetooth, and people are able to kind of automatically track their balance scores in the app. And we also have some balance training video programs in the app available for paid users, and then enables people to actually take action and improve their balance after they're scoring low and realizing that they're high risk. Now they want to know, what can I do about it? And we offer that opportunity also. In a clinical setting, it's actually similar, just at this time, the physician is the one that needs to know, how can I best counsel my patient based on the score they got and based on their other medical information. So we provide software that automatically generates kind of personalized patient counseling for that patient, as well as personalized take-home materials, giving that patient advice on what to do next. We also have a remote patient monitoring application for physicians who want to monitor high-risk patients remotely. They can do that because the patients can have the scale at home. They can have their scores sent into the application, the mobile app, and that mobile app can then send the scores to the cloud, where the physician can then remotely view the patient scores and their trends and other important health information to counsel the patient.
Cool. So that was defining the need. The next thing we want to talk about is kind of the hardware constraint. This only applies, obviously, if you have a hardware device. So if you have a software as a medical device, this probably doesn't apply. But if you do have a hardware, the first question is, what hardware do you need to consider for connectivity, right? So standard things, like, do you do a Wi-Fi? Do you do like a cellular connection? Do you do a Bluetooth only connection? Do you do an app? And stuff like that. A few things to think about when you make those kind of decisions is the operating constraints that you have. And what I mean by operating constraints is simple, like, how much space you have on your board, right? So your device is already, has other things on it. And so that how much battery you need to run that. Obviously, some things like Wi-Fi and cellular will have more battery than a Bluetooth will. So if your device is powered by a battery, do you have a space for bigger battery, or do you need other kind of considerations around that? Processing capabilities, as Kristi mentioned on their hardware, they do a lot of processing. They run a machine learning algorithm. You may or may not have that ability depending on the constraints. So then if you're not doing processing on board, are you then transferring more data out of the device, and do you need that processing done somewhere else? So then consider in terms of bandwidth available. A BLE like environment will have much less bandwidth, or will take more time to transfer data than the Wi-Fi or the cellular options. And then use environment, right? So things like is this a home thing? Is this a clinic thing? Is this somewhere anybody can use anywhere? And those considerations are important, because you get very different kind of network environments at different places. You may have a more stable environment potentially in a clinic. You may be able to set up your own kind of network, Wi-Fi stations there. With a home, it's anybody's gamble what you have, and you may want to think of a cellular option there that's available, or a BLE to a phone and then some storage on phone. that can then sync with the cloud. Another thing is frequency of data delivery. That's important. Is like in case of ZIBRIO, it's when you do the balance. So it's once, twice, 3 times a day, depending on how you do it. But if you have more of a kind of vital transmission things, for example, a heart rate or something like that, breath rate, you may need to transmit more often. Again, that impacts the operating constraints, but that's something to think about. Bandwidth, which again comes back to the same aspects I made, and then the internet user environment, home or not. So those are important things to kind of think about in terms of what you do and hardware. The other thing we're going to think about is, because it does affect hardware also, is encryption, right? So if you're going to store data locally, you probably want to encrypt that. When you transmit data, you want to encrypt over whatever, no matter what you use, you want to encrypt it. And do you have the right hardware for extended encryptions and things like that? Most chipsets today do that, but just to kind of keep track of things to look for when you consider those connectivity hardware. So let's talk a little bit more about software, and then I'll hand on to ZIBRIO, to Kristi, to kind of give her take on what they consider for hardware and software. So first thing I want to kind of talk about is, when you use software, whether you build an app, you build or your software on the device itself that's transmitting, you will end up using some sort of third-party software, whether it be commercial off-the-shelf software or open source software, which is considered kind of in the FDA or 1345 lingo, considered SOUP, software of unknown provenance. So things like that, you have to consider when you do that. You are adding dependencies to your device or to your software. So it's important to keep track of those dependencies. You want to create a software bill of material, an SBOM, and you want to keep track of those, mostly for cybersecurity reasons. We'll talk about that a little bit more detail. But those are kind of consideration when you end up using constant SOAP, is to consider that. And then how does that update pattern matter? Like, for example, if you do an app, and not only you're building your app with maybe third-party software, but you're also running on third-party software, right? On Android or iOS, which you do not control their upgrade cycles, you don't control that. So how are you going to keep up those kind of consideration? And that's important, because if you have a high-risk device, it may make sense to have more control on that hardware, right? So if you have a hybrid device in a clinic environment, you may want to provide a tablet or a phone to the clinician, or maybe even to the patient if the volume is much low. But if you have a more general purpose, more broader set, then you have to really use people's own phone or some hardware like that. And then you have to consider how to kind of manage those dependencies. Another thing very important to consider is, how are you going to deliver software updates, right? So if you build in not just the connectivity, but connectivity opens up the ability to also update your software on the device, and how are you going to deliver that? And you consider space and software parameters for those kind of updates. So that's important. User interaction, if you're going to build an app, how are you going to interact? Is it mostly for display? Is it inputs? Is it, what kind of things are you going to build out? If the device has its own user interface, you can kind of consider that as well, especially around connectivity. How are you going to set up your app or your device? If it's Wi-Fi, you're going to provide them a Wi-Fi console to set up, enter the username, password. If it's Bluetooth, how do you do that? So those kind of things are important to consider when you're defining the software for connectivity and kind of user interaction around that. So let me hand over to Kristi and see kind of what ZIBRIO had to consider around hardware and software.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the first decisions that our team had to make was whether our scale would use Bluetooth versus Wi-Fi. We eventually settled on Bluetooth, but we also had to, as you're talking about the hardware constraints, figure out how much data to store in memory. So to give a little background, many of the members of my team are like scientists, researchers, so of course they want as much data as possible. And then the engineering team is saying like, no, we can't store that many data points in the scale's memory. That's not possible. So it was really a balancing act to kind of settle on what's going to be practical, but still useful for our team, because we always want to be understanding more about balance so that we can provide better insights to our users down the line. Then after those decisions were finalized, we had to figure out how often would we be able to sync the data with the phone, and then in what format. That was really an interesting position for me to be in, trying to negotiate between kind of the firmware team and the mobile app team. Well, who's deciding the basically like the specific message structure of each message that's going back and forth between the scale and the app. And then once it's in the app, we have to decide how to display that data for users in a meaningful way. Then beyond that, we had to decide, how and when is our app going to be syncing to the cloud? Are we enabling users to use the app offline? That's something that we've been considering now going forward. If for a few minutes somebody is outside of cellular data range and not on Wi-Fi, how much do we want to store inside the phone so that somebody can still see it and get some functionality out of the app for those short periods of time? Then finally, when we send all the data into the cloud, into basically the Galen interface, we have to figure out, or before we even decided to use Galen, we had to think about how do we want to display that data for remote patient monitoring situations, especially because that's the primary time when somebody who's not using the app really needs to see the patient data. Or again, for my team and the researchers on my team, how are they going to be able to extract that data in order to develop better user research and user insights going forward? And those things aren't, it's not a given that you're going to be able to extract your data in a good format from the cloud or display it in an intuitive way for the users who need to see it. So we really had to consider so many questions about the data all along the way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point around offline use. So that's one thing to definitely consider, especially if a device is connecting straight to the cloud, that you do want to make sure that the device can be used offline, because networks, the connectivity is, even no matter how resilient the cloud is, fact that you're going to use a lot of things in the middle, whether it be cellular network or Wi-Fi or whatever, you're going to have issues connecting at some point in time. So having the ability to do offline usage, especially if your device is critical to care, that needs to be a high-level consideration. So let's talk a little bit more about, again, regulatory consideration. Like how to classify your connected health component, right? So it could be an accessory to your device. That's an option, and many of our customers do that. They have an app, they have the cloud, they basically make that accessory to the device. When you do that, the classification follows. So if your app, your device is in a class 2 under FDA guidance, then the rest of your ecosystem becomes class 2 as well. Or FDA at least has a concept of medical device data system, essentially a data system that's storing data, does not do any interpretation. It's basically you get what you send in. So if you send a temperature value, it may show you the temperature value. It's not going to make a determination about whether this is a fever or not. Something like that, simple data system, which is a much lower classification than your, maybe lower classification than your device. Or a similar thing that the FDA has come up with is a clinical decision support system, something that does interpretation, but does it in a way that a clinician is already doing it. It's known ways of like a fever. So if it's 104.1, clinically it's considered a fever in most cases. So that those kind of things can be done. So you're still doing interpretation, but they are using standard, well-known, published algorithms or methods doing that. And then, or maybe it's not even a medical device, right? So that's a consideration too. Maybe it's not. And those are all discussions you need to have before you start down this this journey, because that may affect your clearance of your device itself, and they will definitely affect what you put in the FDA files, depending on how you classify those things, and then that tells you what kind of things you have to build out or consider if you're going to buy in terms of the cloud aspect. So I know, Kristi, you guys had to make a similar decision. I don't know where you ended up with that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. So, and I just wanted to mention, like, I think people who are developing connected devices have so many more challenges than someone developing like just a medical device or just a piece of software, because you have to understand like 2 or 3 times more different types of FDA classifications. So it's a lot of learning, I think. In our case, our app is considered more of an accessory to our device. We do have a couple features that are used to control the device. So you can actually use the app to start a balance test on the scale if you want to use the app as like a visual timer during the 60-second test. And you can use the app to like change the units from kilograms to pounds. So there's a couple features that actually directly control the device. But then there's a lot of just general information in the device, in the app, that kind of falls under the just general wellness product category of FDA. So we try to follow those guidelines in terms of the way that we phrase any of the recommendations inside the app. But then, as I showed before, we also have some software that's used in the clinic, and we've classified that as clinical decision support software, like you have here. And so to fall under that classification, as you were saying, we had to make sure that we're always explaining the reason for the recommendation. So if we tell the physician that they need to recommend this particular thing to the patient, right next to that we have a little blurb explaining why we're suggesting that recommendation, so that way they always know and it's not like a black box recommendation. And then yes, in terms of our device itself, our scale, we also had to figure out, you know, is that a medical device? Is it? So we did find out that there was already an existing device called force measuring platform, which is a class 1 device, and that's what our scale falls under. So we were able to just follow the guidance for that specific product code under the FDA for the scale itself.
Cool, awesome. Just reminder, just because it's class 1 doesn't mean it's always exempt from regulation. So you may still have to do a lot of stuff. You just don't need pre-market approval or pre-market authorization before you can sell the device.
Specifically for that product code that I'm mentioning, the force measuring platform, that one is not exempt from the quality system regulation. So we still have to follow all the same quality standards and documentation standards that many other kind of class 2 and class 3 devices might have to follow.
Sure. All right, so now let's kind of talk about risks and mostly around cybersecurity. So while 2021 data is still being compiled, 2020 was a very, very nice year for if you're a cyber criminal. It was a banner year. Some estimates, these are from VMware and Carbon. There was 240 million cyber attacks. This is overall, not just healthcare, but 240 million attacks attempted in 2020. And about from healthcare point, roughly 816 per healthcare endpoint, which means a clinic or hospital. And these were attempted, not all of them successful, but this is just a huge increase from the year prior, almost 1,000% increase. The pandemic did worsen some of this, and we can see in 2021 follow the same curve. So cyber attacks are becoming more common, and they're becoming more common against healthcare. 560 healthcare organizations were impacted by ransomware, which is a growing sector of kind of cyber criminal industry. And it's not limited to healthcare, but in the healthcare, we just have a lot more impact because of the kind of data we have and the kind of controls we have to put in. Roughly 1 million healthcare records were breached per month in 2020. This is according to Wall Street Journal, their estimates. They don't have an exact number, but this is the estimate, roughly 1 million healthcare records. And ransomware as a service, kind of weird thing to say, but it's becoming very popular. There's a lot of startups that essentially sell ransomware to states, like countries, governments for a lot of national security issues, but those then become available in some way to other criminals as well. There is a recorded death in Germany that happened in 2020 that was attributed to a ransomware attack because the hospital that patient was going to was shut down because of ransomware, and then they had to be routed to a facility farther away. And there is estimate that if they had to do that, the patient would have been alive. So there's an actual impact that can happen in people's life because of cybersecurity. And then no surprise here, the US is one of the most targeted countries in the world for ransomware attacks. So the landscape around cybersecurity is just getting worse in terms of attacks being done and the value of those attacks or the success rates of those attacks. And then on the other hand, because of digital health, because of connected devices, we are putting more and more data into kind of the internet. So to kind of address some of these problems over time. There have been a lot of cybersecurity and privacy regulations and standards that have come across. The problem is there are just a lot of them, and there's no harmonization around any of these. So unlike the quality systems, which have kind of tended to harmonize around 1345, in at least in medical device quality systems, that hasn't necessarily happened yet with cybersecurity and privacy regulation. Every country, every body is coming up with their own standards, and while they talk similar things, they don't always follow the same script. So it becomes a very challenging environment and to comply with these things. So just to give an example, some of the laws and regulations, these are not a complete list, but just some of the highlight ones. So in US, for example, we know the HIPAA and then the extension to that High-Tech Act of 2008. So that is again for specifically around healthcare. Some like GDPR, the original EU version, and then since Brexit, the kind of the UK version, which is slightly different from the EU version, applies around data privacy laws. That's not healthcare specific, but it applies to healthcare. Similar, every state is now going after, at least every state in the US is now going after some sort of privacy laws. There's been CCPA and the Massachusetts Data Protection Law for a while. Next year, you will see more states like Colorado, Connecticut, and then updated version of the CCPA coming out from California. Again, they don't harmonize. There's very different rules and regulations around those. Then there is COPPA, which is Children's Privacy Protection Act. So if your devices are dealing with children, you have additional laws around that. The Cloud Act, which many people don't know, but essentially allows law enforcement in the US access to a lot of information that's on the cloud, and some of that affects where you store data. So for example, if you're selling data in the EU, the GDPR kind of prohibits some of that access. So you have to then do a lot more work if you're going to move EU or UK data to US. Or you have to figure out a way to keep that data separate, EU data in EU and US data in US, things like that. And then another one from Canada. On top of that, we have standards that the industry have developed. There's an ISO standard 27001 and 27018, both deal with how to manage information security. UL 2901 as an FDA recognized standard now for managing cybersecurity in medical devices. NIST, the Institute of Standards and Technology, the government institute, has been kind of one of the leading organizations in the US, at least, that talks about cybersecurity and how to manage. Its cybersecurity framework is one of the starting points you should look at when you start your cybersecurity management aspect of it. And there is industry groups like Cloud Security Alliance and HITRUST. They also come up with their own security guidelines or security frameworks. In case of HITRUST, it's a standard that you can get certified to as well. So a lot of things to kind of deal with or manage when you do digital health. It may sound a lot, it may sound like a lot of things to take on, but there is common things you can do that works across all these standards. So what are those? So let's talk about some of these. First thing we do is, like anything in medical device, you got to assess the risk, right? So do a risk assessment, essentially, do a risk planning assessment exercise, review what you're collecting, review what functionality you're exposing, and assess kind of the risks in terms of what happens if the data gets altered or stolen or changed or deleted. What happens if the criminals get access to your device or your backend systems? What can they do? So kind of figure out all the risks you have, and like anything else, bucket the risk into kind of probabilities and severities mostly. With cybersecurity and software in general, we try to not use probabilities as much because it's hard to kind of really justify the probability of if my software can control the voltage given to you, and I can say, hey, the probability of somebody hacking into it's only 1%. One is there's really no justification for that data, but B, that 1% is still big enough severity that doesn't really matter. So severity is important. Some people tend to use probability. We generally don't. So we look at severity, and then we basically identify, the risks around that. Some of the frameworks, like cybersecurity framework from NIST, does consider probability. It uses probability of success, though, not necessarily probability of attack. It assumes that attacks will happen. It's just probability of success of that attack, depending on your controls. But like any other safety risk assessment, you identify the problems that can happen, severity of those risks, and then what controls you can put, and then reassess, does your control lower the risk, or is it enough to kind of get the benefit out of those? It may seem burdensome, but it's that is different ways to do it. One quick way to start with is what's called threat modeling, and there's a lot of good tools. In fact, there is I forget the name. I think it's healthit.gov. It's a government website that has a very good security assessment tool that essentially it's a spreadsheet, but allows you to do a lot of these assessment much easier and in a very methodical way. The next thing I'll talk about is design. Regardless of risk, there's things you can do when you design the software or hardware aspects of it to follow good security. Think about as you're thinking of use cases. Think about things like identity management. Like, how do you know who's the user? Maybe you don't need to know. If you don't need to know, that's fine. But if you do need to know, then figure out where is your identity and access management happening. How do you control who has access to your system? How do you identify that person? How do you know what happened? Like, is an audit trail for that person is doing? So things like that. Passwords. So if you need kind of credential systems, are you using passwords? So how are you managing? What's the kind of the password management aspect of it in terms of strength or complexity needed? That's where some of the balancing act needs to happen, depending on who you're targeting. A lot of people like to have very complex passwords, and the general guidelines in the industry is use a complex password for a unique complex password for every system you have. The problem is if people use 50, 100 systems, there's just no way they're going to do that, right? So they're going to reuse. So you have to assume that the reuse will happen. You'll assume that people will just use very simple passwords, add one or two at the end every time they need to change. So kind of keep that in mind. Do you need to simplify that aspect? Maybe there's different ways of accounting for people. If you're using an app, can you use some sort of biometrics options available in addition to password, and maybe you can bypass some of that password restriction. Maybe you can use multi-factor authentication, things like that, to kind of reduce some of that burden on keeping a very complex password. But design all that stuff in the system. Think about all that. Think about encryption, another very important thing. If you're going to store data on the device or on your app or wherever, and if it has any sort of PHI, you're required, at least in the HIPAA, to encrypt that data. So keep thinking of that, how you're going to, what kind of algorithms you use, what kind of methods you will use, and how you will manage your keys. Because it's important, like you can lock the home, but if you keep the key right underneath the plant pot, then it doesn't really help you. People can still find it. So things like key management is important as well. We already talked about audit trail, and then testing. As you test for functionality, test for security as well. Develop a cybersecurity surveillance program. In medical device, we generally do post-market surveillance where we look around safety and the operating efficiency and things like that of the device. A similar program is needed for cybersecurity as well, where you're keeping track of what's out there, especially if you're going to use a lot of components. You need to make sure those components don't have their own, you need to monitor those components, their vendors, whatever, to see if they have any vulnerabilities that are disclosed, and how do you address those. So those are important things as well. And then one thing I do always emphasize is a lot of these regulations require agreements to be set up. So if you are dealing with third party, which a lot of time you will end up somewhere or other, make sure you have the right agreements with them. For example, under HIPAA, we need a business associate agreement. If anybody other than you are going to transfer the data, you may need that agreement with your healthcare provider as well. If you're dealing with EU or UK, you need some sort of, and you're transferring data, you may need a transfer agreement. You may need a data processing agreement. So different agreements are important to be compliant with the law. So make sure you understand all those aspects around it. And then ultimately, this is the most important thing, is to establish a culture of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity isn't something you add on. It's not something that you can just give it to a team to take care of. It takes the whole company or the whole ecosystem to address, because the weakest link is all we need to have an issue. So establishing a culture of cybersecurity throughout the workforce is important as building the devices or software that is secure. So I guess one of the last topics we want to kind of highlight is the kind of the age-old question, right? Do we build or do we buy? And so let's talk about a little bit of the kind of pros and cons around build versus buy. So if you are building, some of the pros are that you get a fully customizable system and you have a full control and ownership of that system. The cons are essentially the cost and time. It takes money to build and it takes a lot of time to build. And then you add development risk. Anything you build has, project risk around that. So you have to address all that stuff as well. If you buy, the pros are obviously it's more cost effective. You can get to market quicker. You have some risk reduction because you may use a system that's already proven and already out in the market. The cost is you may have to compromise on some functionality because it may not be built exactly to your need. And then obviously you may not have full control and or ownership of that particular system. If you are going to end up building yourself, a few quick pointers. Start with general purpose infrastructure. So don't try to build everything from scratch. Use AWS, Azure, or Google or whatever for your data storage and other functions. Look at the services available. Ensure you do everything under compliance that is needed for your classification. Ensure all security configuration are done properly. Not all cloud systems are designed defaulted to the most secure settings. A lot of time they're designed to what they think is a more general appropriate settings, may or may not be for you. So make sure you have those configurations set up. There's a lot of news around systems being hacked because the configurations weren't done properly, like not encrypted or left open to public, things like that. Build an operational team that's skilled in cloud and cloud IT in general, and then acquire and operationalize good security monitoring and detection tools. And then develop a patching and disaster management system, and then obviously, appropriately safeguard your business. Insurance that you need, and the agreements that needs to be done. So that's your build yourself. If you're going to buy, make sure whoever you're buying that has the right compliance level, the solution was built with the compliance you need. Ensure that they are managing. One of the aspects of buying is, who's going to manage it. If they're going to manage it, that it's fully managed, and otherwise you bear all the operational risks. Understand the track record in terms of privacy and security. Make sure it can scale not just locally, but also scale globally if you're going to add more and more markets to your for your devices. And then understand how version control works, right? So how are as the software evolves, how do you keep up, and how do you have to say in those improvements that are being made? And then just kind of have a good understanding of the responsibilities of the vendor, the liabilities the vendor takes on, and the commitments they are willing to make. So having said that, let me hand on to Kristi to see kind of what was their thought process around the build versus buy. Kristi?
Sure. You can advance the slide so that the words come up. So we were finding a couple difficulties when we were initially trying to do essentially the build approach. So we had basically like a software engineering company that was working with us to build our cloud architecture in AWS. So one of the problems that I was having is that the development team was not really engaging with the compliance and regulation to the level that I felt our company needed them to do. Because obviously we need everything to be HIPAA compliant, and AWS, just because you're using AWS doesn't mean that it's HIPAA compliant. Like, things need to be structured in a certain way, and that requires a level of understanding that I didn't feel our engineers were getting. Then I also felt that we were kind of using up our money quickly without getting all the functionality that we needed. So as a startup, we have a limited amount of money from investors, and we want to be really prudent with how we're using that money. But I didn't feel like we were getting to the place that we could be had we taken a different approach. So that's why we chose to branch out and kind of explore other possibilities. You can advance again to the other bullet points, Abbas.
Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll keep talking. So we saw some benefits. Basically, these are the possibilities that we saw if we were to choose to buy in when we were exploring with Galen. One of the things we saw is that we could get where we need to be more quickly, as I said, and use our funds more wisely. But especially, we would have the opportunity to work with people that had expertise that our team didn't have in-house. So we didn't have anybody, although we were working with developers who were very knowledgeable about, software development practices in general. They didn't know about HIPAA or all these other regulatory concerns that Abbas shared earlier. And that was something that I saw as an opportunity. Of course, we could hire someone who knew all of those things, but if we did, that person is going to be very expensive to employ because they would have many years of experience in a very specific niche. And also, a one-person team can only build things so quickly. So we felt that it was better to kind of leverage the expertise, experience, and also proven concept of Galen, and that's why we chose to go in that direction. So I'll also talk a little bit about kind of the benefits to the users that I've seen since we were able to integrate with Galen. So some of the direct benefits to the end users, one that I was really concerned about in shipping our scales to home users, especially because we started shipping a couple of months ago. I was so afraid, what if we ship the scales and something is wrong? And if we don't have the ability to deploy firmware updates via the app, then people might be stuck with an unusable product if we needed to make a change. And then it's going to be really costly for everybody to ship their scales back to us, and then we have to update them and then ship it back to them. So because Galen already had some framework for firmware updates in their software, we were able to really quickly build a really well-functioning firmware update feature in our app to give us that possibility to deploy firmware updates basically to the field or to home users or professional users, anyone who has the scale in the field. So that made me feel a real sense of relief in terms of ensuring that everybody was going to have the best experience. Because even now, we do usability testing, but there's only, you can only ask so many people their experience. So as we have the scales with actual users in their home, we find more things that we want to improve, and this enables us to give kind of constant improvements to our users to make the product better and better. Then another thing that was helpful, and I know Galen, one of the things that I asked you guys, Abbas, when we were considering working with you was like, well, what if we have an idea of something that we want to do? Like, will you be willing to change it? And I remember a while ago I asked, like, hey, we want to customize the emails that automatically get sent when a user makes an account. And you guys did add that feature. So now that's been really awesome that we can customize automated emails when a new user makes an account. So we can tell them like, hey, this is probably what you should do next. Now that you've made your account, here's the best ways that you can use the product. So that's been also a benefit to our users to kind of enhance their engagement. Then another thing we were struggling with back before we came over to Galen is even though our developers had built some login functionality using AWS, it just randomly stopped working. So I think this goes back to what you had been saying before, Abbas, about having like, do you have a solution that's going to be managed? And we didn't. So we were suddenly left with an app that people couldn't log into. If they were using Android devices, for some reason, Apple users could still log in, and we didn't understand why. But as soon as we switched to using Galen and using all their login system, everything was working again. And it was just a sense of relief that, okay, I know that there's people at Galen who are always going to be making sure that that continues to be working, and we won't just be left like scrambling if something changes. Then I also found that there were benefits to our internal staff team. One main benefit was easy interfaces for members of my team, whether it's the sales team, operations team, to add user accounts. Previously, the way it was structured in AWS, what we had before, it was like a very complicated multi-step process for me to sign in and like find a user and look at their data, or if I needed to reset their account or something. It was really complicated and a bad interface. Obviously, we could have built something custom, but then that's even more resources that we would have had to use. So now in Galen, it's really easy for my team to be able to sign in, locate users if they're having a problem with their account, look at their data. Or we also have some paid features of our accounts that aren't available to all of the users. And it's really easy for someone to go into for my team to go in and add those paid features to somebody's account. So it's just makes our business run more smoothly. And then, as I mentioned before, my team is full of scientists who are always wanting to get the data and analyze it and see kind of what new insights we can bring for people. And now using Galen, it's easy for them to format that data and extract it in such a way that can feed into their pipeline for analysis.
Awesome. So let me end towards kind of some of the key takeaways. So connected health is here to stay. We see a lot of changes coming in the marketplace. There are risks in terms of security, privacy, regulatory, and obviously cost that needs to be managed. But the benefits, greater convenience, easier adherence in terms of patient, improved insights for your team, and then just overall better health outcomes. It's what we all want. So that's connected how does drive, if designed properly, drive to that. So you have to manage the risk, but it's doable. And I hope that this presentation provided some insight into that journey and was helpful. Kristi and I both can take your questions.
Awesome. Abbas, Kristi, thank you guys so much. So a couple questions. We haven't had any come in yet, so if you're still listening and want to throw in some questions, feel free. We did have some questions that were sent in with registration. So Kristi, they're actually both for you. So the first one was, what internal slash external research did ZIBRIO do before deciding on Galen? And I think you've kind of touched on it a little bit, but maybe if you just want to kind of confirm and highlight.
Sure. Well, one thing I didn't mention is I did also confer with some of the staff members that I had been currently employing who were building our build solution, and asked them hey, this is something that I'm looking into, and I showed them the information about Galen, and I asked them how much do you think it would cost for you to do this? And they were like, oh, no way, we can't build that for that price, so I was able, I guess, I don't know if you call that internal or external research, but I conferred with other experts in software development about the offerings and the cost, and they kind of affirmed that decision to go with Galen. Other things I did shop around for other kind of similar services. I won't say that I found anything that was exactly the same at the time that I was looking. Most of what I found was people who were offering really focused on EHR integration, and that wasn't exactly what I was looking for. But there were many companies trying to sell me hey, we'll do EHR integration for you, and there was a lot of missing pieces in the middle that I wouldn't be getting if I worked with those companies. So those were some of the other things that I didn't mention about my research process.
Okay, great. And then the second question is during the experience, have you found any weaknesses or inflexible areas in Galen? Was there an alternative solution needed? I know that during the presentation you had brought up the automated emails, right? So that's probably an example of where they were able to make that switch. But I think that's probably the fear of most companies is, well, it makes sense to do this way, but are there things, what are those things that you're going to run into that it's well, it can't do this, and is that really that big of a deal though? So maybe walk through that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sure in the case of this question, of course, it will be different for everyone. Everyone has a different application that they're going for. So in our case, one of the things that we wanted to do for our remote patient monitoring scenario was we wanted to do some really specific types of visualizations. And I think in data visualization in general, there's no one size fits all solution of how can you visualize all different types of data in an excellent way. So Galen has a variety of different widgets that can be used to visualize data, whether that's tables or graphs. And there were just some really specific things that we wanted to do. So we ended up creating some custom widgets that can then be fit into Galen's interface. But that's something that we did by hiring our own developers to do those custom widgets, even though they still integrate with Galen and they still use the Galen API and everything. But that was one point where we found, there's something just really specific to our application that wouldn't be just a request that I would make that would benefit everyone. I think anytime I see an opportunity, like with the customized emails, or something that could be improved that would probably benefit all of Galen's customers, I know they're always open to that feedback, and they have like a portal where me or my teammates will put in those requests, and they're always really responsive to those things that, that could just improve the product for everybody.
Right. We did have a question about the recording being made available to the public. It will be. So I believe you'll get sent a recording of it or a link to where it can be found. And if not, I think if you go to Galen's website, I don't think, I do know this. If you go to Galen's website, you will be able to find previous webinars as well along with this one. So you can head over to there to get that and be able to share with the team. There's no other questions that had come in. I have a list that we don't have enough time for, so I can take that offline. I guess in closing, I'll add a little tidbit, and then maybe Abbas and Kristi, just a fun question to leave you both with and see your answers. So kudos to both of you, because when I was off screen, my wife rarely ever listens to what I'm talking about in here, but because she's a physical therapist, her ears kind of perked up, Kristi, when you were going through the the presentation a little bit. So you had an extra audience member there for a little while, sitting over my shoulder. But to ask, so Kristi and Abbas, for both of you, the whole surrounding is connecting medical devices. Abbas, you said it's here to stay. I don't think anyone disagrees. For both of you, and Kristi, separate from your product, is there something that you are just most excited about when it comes to connected medical devices? Like, what's the space that's coming that you're like, oh, I just can't wait to see this? So if that's for both of you, I don't know who wants to start.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure, I can start. So one thing that I've thought about a lot, at one point I was at some, I don't know, design and healthcare event, and we were having a roundtable, like a discussion group, and one surgeon was at my table, and I said something like, I don't think that like EHR, I don't know what to call it, like MyChart, MyChart and those sort of applications, they're not really patient-centered. So I'm waiting for one that's patient-centered. And that surgeon was like, what are you talking about? Of course that they're patient-centered. And then I said, oh, then why do I have a different account for when I go see this doctor or this doctor? I have to log into a different portal. And I think it clicked for him like, oh, you're right. Like, they're not patient-centered. They're centered around the physician or the healthcare system or whatever, whoever has purchased that product. So what I'm excited about in the future, and I think it's still not here yet, is kind of a truly patient-centered healthcare applications that really put the patient in control of their own data and in control of their own health, and where the physicians are kind of, they're the secondary people. That's where I hope that it will go.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Abbas, before you go, real quick, just to comment on this, I was at a conference where we talked endlessly about this, and the conclusion that was made was that a lot of these systems are built around the revenue and billing cycle of healthcare systems. And until that changes, it will continue to be a problem for us, physicians, whoever is consuming the healthcare. So that's like a whole nother webinar, but I love that you brought that up. Abbas, what about you?
So for me, it's more of a macro thing, right? So the biggest issue with healthcare is essentially the cost, right? So how does digital health in general, connected devices help that? And that there's many different tangents to that, and from remote patient monitoring to early diagnosis to more intelligent diagnosis to just the ability for the patients to take care, to get control of their healthcare data, to get control of their cost. To better market kind of segments and just how we pay for healthcare. A lot of those things that eventually they all get tied to basically make healthcare more effective and more efficient and hopefully less costly. So I think that's where I see, or I'm excited about, is how does digital health play a role in getting those costs under control and getting better access to people that may not have access to healthcare. So, a better equity, better control of healthcare in general, and that's my kind of thing I look forward every day.
Awesome. Okay, well, great. This has been great. Abbas, Kristi, thank you so much. For those who are still on, the information here for Galen is on the slide. GalenData.com is a great place to go. info@galendata.com, great way to get in contact. Abbas and Kristi are both on LinkedIn, so I'm sure you could reach out there if you have questions specifically for them. But yeah, Abbas, Kristi, thank you so much for your time. And thanks everyone for listening and attending, and have a great rest of your day.